Hey, good morning. Thank you so much for coming today. This is a giant, intimidating hall to fill. So I'm just very excited that there are people here at all because it's really early for game developers. So thank you so much for coming. And I have to say, I'm really excited to be here. This is my fourth GCAP in as many years, and I want to give a shout out to Film Victoria, who they were the first ones who brought me over as part of the International Speakers Program. And then they gave me a little last-minute sponsorship this year, and they're just such an amazing force for good in this industry, so I just wanted to give them a little acknowledgement and thank them. So before we get started, I wanted to ask you all a couple of questions. How many of you here are producers? Okay, a few of you, right? And how many of you are not producers, but you're team leads in a different discipline? Cool, all right, welcome. And how many of you would rather stick pins in your eyes than ever manage people? Anybody? You are the wisest amongst us all, without a doubt. So I guess since I have a sense of who you are, I should probably introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Amy Dallas, and I run Clutch Play Games out of Portland, Oregon. So Clutch Play started out almost 8 years ago as an indie studio, and over time we evolved into kind of a niche engineering consultancy, and we work with game companies and film studios up and down the west coast of the US. But before I started Clutch Play, I've been pretty much a producer my entire adult life in some form or fashion, and I've worked in AAA, small to medium-sized game companies, as well as indie studios. And as someone who's seen this job from all possible angles, I have to say, it is by far the people stuff that's the hardest, right? So, it's never quite as simple as getting a bunch of people together and saying, here, let's make a thing, and here's what I need you to do, and here's when I need you to do it. Some people can totally meet those expectations, and other people are gonna struggle. And I think one of the biggest follies that we have as leaders is expecting people to react to expectations the way we would. Right? Sometimes to be a good leader, you have to meet people where they are instead of expecting them to act like you would in any given circumstance. And that is what drew me to the Four Tendencies. Have any of you ever heard of this? No, not so big here? So the Four Tendencies actually was a book written by Gretchen Rubin, who's an author and a habit expert. And her goal in writing this book was to come up with a framework to help people understand how they themselves and the people around them deal with expectations. And in her model, expectations come in two basic forms. There's external, which are the requirements that other people place on us, and internal, and those are the requirements that we place on ourselves. And in looking at how people dealt with those internal and external expectations, she found that most of us fell pretty logically into one of four behavioral categories. And those were upholders, obligers, questioners, and rebels. So I want to start off by giving kind of just a high-level overview of who the Four Tendencies are, and then we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each and how I've applied what I've learned about them in a game team environment. So let's start out with the upholders. So according to the Gretchen Rubin model, upholders are people who are really readily able to meet both those internal and external expectations. So these are high achievers, both personally and professionally, and whether it's a work goal or a personal project, once they decide to do something, they have no problem following through and committing. So these people are all about efficiency, achievement, rules, and boundaries. Next, you have the obligers. And obligers are also really good at meeting those external expectations, but often they do so by prioritizing their obligations to other people over their own needs and goals and aspirations. So in other words, these are people pleasers through and through. They're very dutiful and team-oriented and loyal, and they tend to value these qualities over things like self-care or looking after their own self-interest. So next you have the questioners, and questioners are not especially interested in meeting any external expectations until and unless they feel like doing so is the correct and justifiable option. So these people value information, analysis, debate, and choice. And next you have the rebels, and rebels are pretty much going to reject all expectations, whether internal or external. So they can present some really interesting managerial challenges because unless what you need a rebel to do happens to coincide with what they actually want to do, not only can you not make them do it, they can't make themselves do it. So rebels are all about freedom, authenticity, taking on really big, hard, interesting challenges that kind of align with their goals and interests, and having choices. So when it comes to upholders and obligers, when you need something done, all you got to do is ask them. When you're talking about a questioner, you can't just ask them, you have to come prepared to convince them. And with rebels, you can't convince them, they just have to decide for themselves. So everybody with me so far? Anybody think they know which one they are? Okay. If you don't, by the time we end, you definitely will. And in fact, when I first heard of the Four Tendencies, I actually heard the author speak on a podcast. And she was talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the four. And I totally recognize myself by the worst of my tendencies qualities. I'm like, yeah, that's totally me when I'm absolutely not functioning at my best. And so I thought it was really interesting. And I went out and got the book, and I dove into it. And not only could I suddenly understand myself and my own choices and defaults around meeting expectations, but suddenly all my coworkers, past and present, came into sharp focus, my team, my clients, and I suddenly found I really understood people better than I ever had before. In terms of my own team, I could suddenly understand why in certain circumstances we did really well, and in others we struggled. So for example, we're a team of consultants, right? This was not something we aspired to do. We aspired to make our own games. We took on one consulting job maybe 7 years ago, thinking we're just going to make some money and move on. And we found we really liked it. Well, as it turns out, my team is almost 50-50 upholders and obligers with one glorious rebel thrown in to keep things interesting. And so we're naturally predisposed to be good at consulting, right? Because when you're consulting, you have to meet external expectations, you have to underpromise, overdeliver, you've got to be people-oriented, efficient, and those are all the qualities that we kind of naturally have. At the same time, looking back on some conflicts we've had in the past, through the lens of the Four Tendencies, I suddenly realized, actually what I thought were personality conflicts were actually tendencies clashing. There were people having different expectations about what others should be doing, how they should get things done, and getting frustrated with each other. So understanding how there can be those conflicts really helped me as a leader to get in front of them before they became a problem. And for anybody doing consulting, when you have to step into a client situation where you don't know people, I found it really interesting to be able to ask people a few questions, get a sense of who they were, and know how to work with them to get the best out of them. So I think talking about this today fits really neatly into the theme of this year's conference, which is lighting the way, because it definitely lit the way for me. So I hope you find it as interesting as I do. But let's move on and do a little bit of a deeper dive, and again, I want to start with the upholders. So again, upholders are people who really readily meet those internal and external expectations, and they're pretty much the gold standard of achievement. So the name in and of itself kind of tells you who they are. They uphold the norms and values and expectations you have from your team and your company. So for all those reasons, they tend to make good leaders. In fact, a lot of you who are producers and team leads may very well be upholders. Because upholders, they're organized, they're achievement-oriented, and they can always be counted on not just to do what needs to be done, but to do what's right for the greater good. They're extremely reliable and self-disciplined, and they really place a high premium on efficiency and time management. From a production standpoint, I find my upholders are really good at nailing their estimates like nobody else. If I ask an upholder, hey, when do you think you can get that done? They'll say, Friday, and what they really mean is like Wednesday night or Thursday morning, because they are so into under-promising and over-delivering. And if anything gets in the way, is potentially going to get in the way of them delivering by Friday, I will know about it well in advance, because upholders don't like surprises, so they don't give you any surprises. Also, they're very predictable and methodical. That's part of what makes them good about nailing their estimates, and these are traits that kind of carry into their personal lives as well. So they're very good at setting effective boundaries. Upholders on your team tend to be the people who come in at the same time every day, they have lunch at the same time, They leave bang on, right at 8 hours, and then they go home and they work on their personal projects. So you're not going to see an upholder spending, nights and weekends in the office, because generally they don't need to, because they're getting their stuff done and they're leaving. So for all the aforementioned reasons, upholders require little to no supervision. They're kind of your set it and forget it people. You tell them what you need, you sit back and you wait for them to deliver, and it's really just as simple as that. So all that sounds great, right? Who wouldn't want those kinds of people on your team? Steady, efficient, good at their estimates, all good stuff. However, there is no one tendency that's better than the other. And as anyone knows, sometimes people who are highly efficient are sometimes not super flexible. Efficiency and flexibility sometimes are at odds with each other. And there's the old production phrase, people plan and the gods laugh. Sometimes things just go sideways and you have to roll with it. And upholders are not so good with rolling with it. They can also, a quirk of the upholders is they can be really impatient with people who aren't like them, because they're so good at whatever they set their mind to. They don't tend to need any hand-holding, help setting boundaries, any check-ins, any argument or debate. They just put their head down and work. And so this is something to be aware of if you're an upholder leader. Just because you don't need these things doesn't mean the people around you don't need them as well. And also a funny byproduct of being really good at anything you set your mind to is that when something goes wrong, because upholders are so careful and meticulous and they tend not to make as many mistakes as the rest of us, they don't handle it well because they're not accustomed to ever being in a circumstance where they might be criticized. And so upholders not only tend to take criticism poorly, they also have a tendency to beat themselves up when something goes wrong. And part of being so careful and so worried about making mistakes is you tend not to put yourself in circumstances where you might make a mistake. So a lot of times upholders can be a little bit risk averse, so they are not going to be super comfortable necessarily on projects that require that of them. And the last thing about upholders is that they are rule followers at their core, and so they are not necessarily going to be the first people to step up and challenge assumptions. So they're not going to ask you, why are we doing it this way? They'll just say, what do you want me to do? So as I mentioned, I have a lot of upholders on my team, and so having an understanding of what makes them happy and productive was incredibly useful to me. And one of the biggest things that I've learned is that upholders thrive in an environment and a culture of efficiency. So what does that mean? Well, let's take meetings, for example. The only thing an upholder hates more than a meeting is a meeting that starts late, is unfocused, and doesn't end on time, because they see that as a waste of their most valuable resource, which is time. So understanding that about them has enabled me to sort of change the way I run meetings. So my team all knows they have to show up on time, they have to come prepared. And we have an agenda when we do our meetings, and the goal is always to tick through that agenda as quickly as possible. So it might be a half-hour meeting on the calendar, the goal is always to get out in 10 minutes or less. And once we've actually satisfied all the items on the agenda, I'll usually say, okay, anybody who wants to go can go, anyone who wants to stay and ask questions, you can stay. And that's when all the upholders to a person will bail, and all the questioners will say, I have questions, and you spend the next 20 to 25 minutes answering all these weird random questions that maybe had nothing to do with anything you talked about, but still are important to them. Another thing about a culture of efficiency is that a culture of efficiency and mandatory overtime are very much at cross purposes with each other. And I know this is a big thing in the games community right now, that we're all kind of looking at crunch. And I think the best argument against crunch, the most effective one, is to basically point out to your senior management that having a lot of mandatory overtime is actually going to torture your most productive people. They are not going to thrive in that environment. I worked at EA many years ago during the mandatory crunch time, the EA spouse time, if you all remember that. Some of you maybe weren't even alive during that time. I don't even know, that was a while ago. And there was a constant push to make people work mandatory overtime, and I was always pushing back on that because in my mind, I wanted my team to be efficient and get their work done. I didn't want them to feel like they just had to fill a seat after hours because it made people feel, made senior management feel better. So another thing about upholders that I've learned is they're not gonna accommodate any last minute change very comfortably. So if you do have to have them work late or work over a weekend, if there are special circumstances, giving them as much notice as possible is really important. Also, if scope is going to change, that's another thing that they usually are going to want to know that well in advance so they can kind of rejigger their plans. Excuse me, another important thing with upholders is to make sure your assignments and your deadlines are clear. Again, the thing that they hate most is spinning their wheels and wasting time, so the more you can do to ensure their time isn't wasted, the happier they are. Again, they don't need micromanagement, they resent it, so don't bother ever trying that with them. And the other thing I've learned is not to put them in high-stakes situations when they haven't had time to prepare. So this is a lesson I learned the hard way not too long ago. I have, as I said, a number of upholders on my team, but one in particular is like the platonic ideal of an upholder. He makes mistakes so infrequently that we all kind of rejoice when he does, because we're like, wow, you are actually human, unlike the rest of us, because we make mistakes all the time. So I happened to ask him to join me on a sales call, and this was with potential clients we had never met before. There was a lot of people on that call. And I asked him to join kind of at the last minute, thinking, okay, maybe if there's some engineering stuff that I can't answer, we'll have him there. Well, as it turned out, these clients had a totally different idea of what this call was going to be. Instead of giving us the high-level overview of what they were looking for and their timeline and budget, they wanted to give my guy an engineering test over the phone, which was bizarre. I've never had that before. And the engineering test they wanted to give him was in Unity, and moments before, he'd been working in Unreal, trying to get a game performance on unreleased hardware. And anybody who's ever tried to do that knows it is just banging your head against the wall. There's no documentation, there's nothing but trial and error until you can make it work. So that's where his mind was before jumping on this call. And so suddenly they're like, hey, answer a bunch of low-level questions about Unity. And these are things he would normally be able to answer 50 times, 50 ways from Sunday. But in that particular moment, that required a context shift that he just couldn't make. And so I think in his mind, he was like, well, I can fail in front of a live studio audience, or I can just bail. I'm totally gonna bail. And so he made this really awkward excuse and went, I'm out, and kind of jumped off the call. And it was super awkward. In fact, I knew someone else on that call, and he's texting me going, you should have him on sales all the time, because he's a natural. I'm like, oh, please don't make me laugh right now. This is not good. And so afterward, we jumped on a call together, and I think he thought I was gonna just rip him a new one, which maybe at another point I might have. But instead, pretty much the conversation was along the lines of, I'm really sorry, I set you up to fail. That was totally my fault. You had a right to expect better from me. I know you need time to prepare, I didn't give you that. So I think maybe we can both agree you could have handled it a little better than that, but at the same time, that was not your fault. The learning opportunity was mine. And had I not taken responsibility for that, I think it could have potentially changed our relationship, because it was my fault, and he shouldn't have been blamed for that. But, so by taking responsibility, a situation that could have been really bad ended up being very, very positive. So I should probably move on to the obligers here. So obligers, again, are people who are good at meeting the external expectations, but often at their own expense. And they're great, dutiful people they tend to have really good attitudes. From a production standpoint, everybody loves obligers. And in fact, I think the games industry counts on having a very large obliger population because they're the ones who kind of make miracles happen sometimes when miracles should not happen, right? So similarly to the upholders, obligers often find their way into leadership positions. In fact, I bet a lot of you who are producers might be obligers because that temperament really lends itself to production so well. But there are different kinds of leaders than upholders. Upholders, again, they're achievement-oriented and steady and steadfast. Obligers make good leaders because they actually care about people. They're really team-oriented. They always put the needs of others above their own. And they can always be counted on to do what needs to be done. So they will give till it hurts always. They'll work long hours out of a sense of duty. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's a thing. And they have an incredibly strong desire to help others. So dutiful, team-oriented, selfless, those are fantastic qualities on any team. However, do you guys recognize who that is? It's a really old movie. Yeah, the soap and the sock guy from Full Metal Jacket. He starts out like a sweet dork, and then he turns into a killing machine when people abuse him. That is totally obligers, the dark side of the obliger. So one of the quirks of the obliger is because they're so always wanting to help people and do the right thing, and they never want to say no. So that makes them a soft target for people who want them to do extra stuff that they shouldn't be asked to do. So as producers and team leads, often we're the gatekeepers, right? So people know that if they come to us with something that shouldn't be done, we're going to say, no, forget about it. So generally I find, especially in big team environments, if they think you're going to say no, that person will run around you and go straight to the nearest obliger and plead their case and say, please, please, will you do my thing? And because they never want to say no, often they will do something they shouldn't have done, and you won't find out that this person stayed late and worked till midnight on something that they shouldn't have been working on until after the fact. So you often will find out when they're cranky and burnt out the next day, or when you're like, hey, where's that thing I asked you to do? And they'll say, oh, well, I was working on someone else's stuff. And you're like, why did you do that? So that can be a challenge for obligers. So for those reasons, because they never want to say no and they take on too much, and obligers can be terrible at delegating because they always think, like, I can totally do this, I can take it all, I can do everything. But sometimes there just aren't enough hours in the day, right? So you take on too much and then you can't get it all done, and they are very much at risk for that. So for all those reasons, they are very susceptible to being exploited, to getting burned out, getting overworked, and turning into the Full Metal Jacket guy. So as I mentioned, I have a lot of these people on my team, and I'll be honest, I take the weight of responsibility of looking after them very seriously because they struggle to look after themselves. So they do need someone to keep an eye on them and make sure that they don't overwork themselves because that is what they're naturally predisposed to do. And another thing that's really interesting about obligers is that I think they're often misunderstood because people think, oh, they just love to work and they have such a good attitude, so I can just keep giving them stuff and they won't mind. But I've found that most obligers actually don't just work out of the goodness of their heart. They're people pleasers at their core, so they crave recognition. But they don't always articulate what that recognition that they want is. But I have found that most obligers do, they want all the things everyone else wants. They want raises and bonuses and promotions, maybe team awards, something meaningful to them. But they won't tell people that that's what they want. They'll sit back and say, well, can't you see this is what I deserve? And if that does not, sort of come to fruition, if they don't get the thing that they're expecting, they can go to a very dark place. And this is something Gretchen Rubin calls obliger rebellion. Again, soap in the sock guy. This is actually, I'm sure everybody's kind of been in that place where you have someone on your team who's really sweet and nice, and then one day they're just like, screw this, I'm out of there, and they quit. Or they'll rage quit, or they'll suddenly have a really, seemingly bad attitude. Well, that didn't happen overnight. That was just resentments piling up and piling up. So you have to actually look after them because not only will they not look after themselves, they can build up some resentments if they're not taken care of and acknowledged. So again, I have a lot of these people on my team. I imagine most of you do as well. According to Gretchen Rubin, they're the largest population amongst the 4 tendencies. So again, taking the weight of responsibility, I think all of us really need to do that for the obligers on our team. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned about how to do that is to resist the temptation to lean on them too heavily. And I will admit, I have totally been guilty of that in the past, because thinking back on it, sometimes questioners, rebels, and upholders will hassle you if you ask them to go above and beyond when that needs to happen sometimes, and obligers never will. And so it's human nature to, in a tense situation, to go to the person who's going to make it easy for you to ask them, to ask something of them. And I think as producers and team leads, we all have to dig deep and not lean too heavily on people just because they make it easier for us. Another thing, again, running interference for people when they're soft targets for predatory nonsense. I found that one of the things that's most effective with obligers, when you know that people are going to them trying to get them to do extra stuff, is to proactively reach out to them and say, hey, I know it's really hard for you to say no, and I don't ever want you to be in a situation where you have to do that. So here's what I want you to do. If anybody comes to you and asks you for something that you shouldn't be doing, send them back to me. I am happy to be the bad guy, which is another fun upside of being a producer and a team lead, constantly being the bad guy. And so in doing that and asking them to send the person back to you, it's kind of a win-win for the obliger. Because not only are they they don't have to say no, but you're also creating an external expectation with them, right? And this is actually what they're so good at. They're really good at doing what other people ask them to do. So you're asking them to let you take their problem away. So that is definitely an effective strategy with them. Also, it's really important to make it okay for them to set boundaries, because that's something that they're really uncomfortable with. And funnily enough, I think a lot of obligers don't want to set boundaries because they really fear that in doing so, they're going to be told they have a bad attitude. And the great irony is, more often than not, when obligers try to set a boundary, they do get told they have a bad attitude, because they're like, hey, you were always so nice, why are you telling me no now? So that is a terrible situation for them. So not too long ago, so by the way, it's really good to help people, as a producer or a team lead, to help your obligers set boundaries that they are uncomfortable with. So not too long ago, my team and I started a project. It was short-term. The clients had some pretty urgent needs. They needed to sort out some technical things before a big launch. And my obliger on my team took their problem very seriously and started working really long, crazy hours trying to help them get their issues resolved. And I kept saying, I really wish you would not work this much. Please, please stop working so hard, because I see you getting crabby. I see you heading into obliger rebellion. You can slow down. And he kept saying, no, I can't, I have to keep going. And that's a big thing with obligers. They're not always volunteering because they want to. The line between want to and have to gets very murky with them. So they often feel like, I have to keep going, I have to do these things. So he was kind of killing himself until one night my client reached out to me at like midnight on Slack. And he's like, I feel like I'm breaking your dude. Like he was really worried. He's like, I see him, he's killing himself. I keep telling him he doesn't have to work this hard, and I don't know what to do. And I said, thank you so much, because I am struggling to communicate this to him as well. So I'm so glad you said that. I'm going to talk to him, and now there's 2 of us. So the next day, I sat him down, and I'm like, look, the client and I both appreciate so much how hard you're working. But here's the thing. I feel like you walked into a cage at the beginning of this project and you slammed the door shut and you don't realize there's no lock on the door. You can walk out anytime you want. So nobody wants you to burn out and flip out and leave, right? So I want you to be happy and feel sane. What can I do to support you in not working so hard? And he's like, so every day at like a certain hour, can you just DM me and tell me to leave? Tell me to stop working? And I'm like, yeah, is it that simple? Okay, sure. So, in telling the story, and people in the past have said to me, well, gosh, why would you tell someone who really wants to work hard to stop working? That seems against your self-interest. A lot of big companies would think that's crazy. But my self-interest is having an employee who's happy and sane and not falling apart. So it's really important, if they can't set boundaries, help them do that. And of course, acknowledge extra effort they put in. This is not every, upholders might go, oh, that's nice, you appreciated me. But for obligers, this is what they live for. So it's really important to show appreciation. I'm sure most of you know that, but it bears saying anyway. So I'm going to move on to the questioners. And questioners, I got to say, I found them really interesting because I don't think I understood people with this tendency quite as well as I do now. And I have so much more kind of understanding and compassion for them than I did once upon a time. So again, questioners are people who not especially interested in meeting those external expectations until and unless they feel like doing so is the correct and justifiable option. And the way that they arrive at that point is they just want to gather facts, decide for themselves, and act with good reason, which is fair, right? That's pretty reasonable. So in other words, they're going to do what makes sense to them according to their own best judgment. And when they have arrived at that point where they are locked and loaded on a solution, they really have the ability to embody the best of all the four tendencies. They have the reliability of obligers, they've got the authenticity of rebels, and they've got that commitment and efficiency of upholders. So they are amazing when they're firing on all cylinders and ready to go. They're also, much like the upholders, they really appreciate efficiency and logic. And another thing, the very nature of a questioner is to challenge everything, to go into any situation saying, why is this way? How could it be better? How can we get the same result by doing things differently and more efficiently? So they're really good at improving systems, and they're very good at challenging the status quo. So they make incredible change agents. In fact, I think as an industry, we're seeing a lot more questioners kind of coming to the fore, asking, why is crunch a thing? Why are we doing things this way? How could they be different? That's the questioner tendency rising up and making its presence felt. So that said, the authenticity that questioners have can kind of be a double-edged sword in certain circumstances. Because again, they're only going to act when they feel like something is right and reasonable. And so in the process of trying to figure that out, they can sometimes come across in a way that makes them seem really stubborn and intractable and really confrontational. In fact, my favorite questioner story came from a friend of mine, and one day we were talking, and she's like, oh, my husband is driving me crazy. He picks all these stupid fights with me, and I can't stand it. And I'm like, well, give me an example. And she's like, yeah, well, okay, perfect example. Last night I'm making dinner, and he comes into the kitchen and points to the counter, and it's like, hey, how old is that butter? And she's like, why do you want to know? I don't want to, just tell me, how old is the butter? What are you accusing me of, using old butter? I don't know, why are you being weird? Why are you being weird? It just went on and on like that until she's finally like, screw you, make your own dinner. And it just kind of, the whole night fell apart. So I was like, I don't want to get in the middle of all that, but I'm gonna text you a link to a book and maybe check it out and let me know what you think. And a week or so later, she sends me a text that says, me, upholder, husband, questioner. And in parentheses, she writes, dude just wanted to know how old the butter was. And I'm like, dude just wanted to know how old the butter was, right? So that is, he wasn't trying to pick a fight with her. He wanted to know how old the butter was, and when she didn't answer him, he cranked up the aggression a little bit. And that's the thing about questioners, is that sometimes in their quest for information, they don't really have the self-awareness to realize, I'm freaking this person out. Like, I'm being aggressive with them, because they don't see themselves as being aggressive. They see themselves as wanting an answer they're not getting. So, but I will say, I've been in the crossfire of some heavy questioner stuff, and it can feel really confronting and hostile. So, in fact, somebody at GDC came to me after I gave this talk, and he's like, I'm totally the butter dude, I just want to say, and suddenly all of my relationships make so much more sense to me. So, he had a real moment of self-reflection there. So, excuse me. So when a questioner isn't getting the information that they want, they can get a little obstructionist. And they have absolutely no problem making everything grind to a halt until they have the information that they need, which is sometimes not ideal. And another thing that they kind of struggle with is analysis paralysis. They can get in a very recursive way of thinking. It's like, okay, well, we could handle it this way, or we could handle it this way, or there's this other way, but I like the first way. Maybe the third way is good. And they can kind of get stuck in that pattern where they can't make decisions. And another really hilarious quirk of the questioner is, ironically, they don't respond well to being questioned themselves, which I find really funny. And I think part of the reason for that is because questioners, I think they have such an intense decision-making process that once they've made that decision, they just don't want to have to revisit it. Also, I think that they feel like their skills of decision-making are superior to the rest of us, so they're like, I don't want to explain myself to you. So again, questioners, I feel like I understand them a lot better and I have so much more compassion and appreciation for them. And the biggest thing that I've learned about working with questioners is, don't take them personally. Don't take it personally. I know it's really hard when somebody's like, how's the butter? That kind of thing. But they're not trying to be jerks. They're trying to get information. And I find sometimes when I'm dealing with the questioner and they're really cranking up the aggression, it's a good opportunity to step back and go, I think I'm answering their question, but they don't think I'm answering them because they're getting they're getting frustrated with me. So maybe I need to take a step back and approach this differently to make sure I'm getting them what they need instead of taking offense. Give them time and space to research and ask questions and also make decisions. So I do find that when I'm dealing with questioners on my team or a client's team, I will usually pad up their estimates by at least 20 to 30% because it always takes them longer than they think it will because they spend extra time researching and really understanding the problem space. Again, in meetings, I make sure they always have time for their questions. And also, one thing that I've learned really recently, a lot of executives, like people who found startups and companies, a lot of them are questioners because it really lends itself to an entrepreneurial way of life, that questioner tendency. And I found that sometimes when you have a questioner in a leadership position, as producers or team leads, you'll go to that person and say, here's a proposal, I'd love a decision. And it's really tempting to take what they say in that moment in the meeting, their reaction to your proposal as their decision, but in their minds, it's not their decision. They're only going to decide when they go off, they think about it, and then they come back to you with what they've decided. So if you're dealing with a questioner, never assume that what they've said in response to something you just presented them is actually their final thought on the matter. Another thing that's really important is to provide thoughtful justifications when assigning work. It's not just, it's more effective to say to a questioner, here's what I want, and here's why I want it, and here's the information you might need to do it, and this is why I need to have it done. Usually that will reduce the friction, and they'll say, oh, okay, as opposed to, here's the thing, go do it. And when asking them questions, be prepared to explain why you're asking, because again, they don't really enjoy being questioned, so if you're trying to schedule time on their calendar, instead of saying, hey, when are you free? You have to say, when are you free? Because I have a meeting at 4 in which I need some information from you, and I only have between 2 and 3 available, or whatever. So the more information you can give them when asking a question, the more likely they will respond to you. So last but not least, I'm running out of time, so I got to move on to the rebel. And one thing I want to say about the rebel, I want to put this in some context, because I think most people conflate what someone looks like with whether or not they're a rebel. Like they might see someone walking down the street with pink hair and 2 different shoes on and a surgically implanted unicorn horn in the middle of their forehead, and they'll think, oh, that person's a rebel. Well, not necessarily. Maybe they're a questioner who's like, why should I look the way you think I should look? Or maybe they're an obliger who's like, hey, I live my life to please other people. This horn's for me, bro, so back off, So how someone looks is not indicative of what their tendency is. In this particular model, a rebel is someone who struggles to meet both internal and external expectations unless it's something that they really want to do. So again, they do present some managerial challenges, But I also don't want to give you the impression that they're not good people to have on your team. As I said, I have a glorious rebel, and I love him, and I would trade him for nothing. He's unbelievable. But you also have to know how to work with him. So the good side of rebels is that because they kind of march to the beat of their own drum, they are really good at thinking of solutions that the rest of us wouldn't think of, creative solutions, technical solutions. They are really solid, out-of-the-box thinkers, and they tend to thrive when what you're asking them to do aligns with their personal goals and interests and values. And a huge thing for rebels is they love big, hard, interesting challenges. They live for that. In fact, the one piece of advice that Gretchen Rubin has to get a rebel to do something is to tell them that they can't do it. And they'll be like, really? I'm going to show you. That is one of your few tools of manipulation to get a rebel to do something. And they can be highly productive as long as they're allowed to do things their way. In other words, rebels need to do things their way or not at all. And when you see this whole list develop, you'll go, oh, no wonder America is in such bad shape. So they tend to, another challenge of the rebel is they tend to be very individually oriented and not team oriented, so they will often think of what's good for them first as opposed to what's good for the team, so sometimes that can create some challenges and resentments among the other tendencies. And they will 100% of the time resist being told to do something or how to do it. So pretty much if you walk up to a rebel and say, here's what I want you to do, and here's how I want you to do it, they're just gonna go, nope, and walk off, and that's the end of the discussion. So they can kind of at their worst be pretty stubborn and uncooperative, and they will genuinely struggle with small routines, planning, minutiae. That is hell for them. So if you give a rebel like a bunch of JIRAs to do and just go, here's do a bunch of JIRAs, that is so not gonna happen. Those are gonna sit there forever. Unless those JIRAs are in service to solving some big, interesting problem, probably not gonna, they're just not gonna do it. And they have a lot of trouble accomplishing tasks that require consistency, and they're not especially fond of deadlines. In fact, there's a quote in the Four Tendencies book where Gretchen Rubin is talking about a rebel, and they're saying, well, how could I possibly know how long it's going to take me when I might not feel like doing it? Like, that is totally the rebel. So, as I mentioned, I have a rebel on my team. I love him to death. And understanding how to work with him and get the best out of him has been the most interesting experience I've had in my managerial life. And the biggest thing that I've learned is understanding what motivates a rebel and assign them work accordingly. So not too long ago, we started a new project, and I put a rebel, an upholder, and an obliger, which sounds like the beginning of a terrible joke or something. And I put the three of them on this project, and I knew that I was rolling the dice putting the rebel on this project because it was not a game project. It was our only non-game related project, and it involved a tech stack that he was not only not familiar with, but not interested in learning. And so the client, when we came in, they said, here's a big stack of JIRAs, so you can be productive while you're learning the code base. The Upholder and the Obliger were like, great, I love being productive. I love learning new things. And the rebel was like, nope, and he was just having a very hard time. He was kind of fomenting discontent and just not ramping as fast as I know he normally can. And so I did talk to him at one point and said, what's going on? He's like, I don't know. And then a day or two later, he sent me this very anguished email saying, I don't want to let you down. You've been really good to me, but I've never been good at learning things that don't interest me. I'm not interested in this, and I'm having a really hard time, and I don't want to leave you high and dry, and I don't want to leave the company. I just don't know what to do. And I knew, I wasn't surprised by that. I could kind of see that that was what was happening. And I didn't want to lose him, and I didn't want him, kind of being unproductive either. But I also knew the client really needed his help because this guy is brilliant at solving problems. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, will you give me the chance to try and make this better for you? If I can make it better, will you give me a chance? And he said, yes, of course. So I went to the client and said, hey, here's the thing with this guy. Giving him a big stack of JIRAs is not going to work for him. So he is really good at solving big, hard, unsolvable problems. So here's what I propose. I may need to take him off the team because he's having a little bit of a hard time ramping, but what I'd like to do instead is I want you to give me the biggest, hardest problem that no one has been able to solve, and I'm gonna give it to him. And if he can't do anything with it in a few weeks, I just won't bill you for his time. And he was like, great, of course, I have nothing but big, hard, unsolvable problems, so sure. And so he did that, and I went back to my Rebel and said, okay, here you go. Nobody's been able to solve this problem for 18 months. You want it? He's like, hell yeah. So within about a week and a half, he had ramped at superhuman speed. He was up there with the most senior engineers who've been on the project for years in terms of his understanding. And within 3 or 4 weeks, he had made a problem that they couldn't solve for 18 months go away. And he's continued to do that on that project ever since. And that is the power of harnessing the rebel tendency. They are not bad people to have on the team at all. They're amazing. You just have to know how to use them correctly. So when assigning work, another thing that's really important with them is focus on the problem, not on the task. They have no patience for tasks, but they have infinite patience for problem solving. And then as far as like when you're dealing with a rebel, when you need them to do something they don't want to do, you don't have a lot of options. Really all you can do is give them the information they need to make the decision along with the attendant consequences, and then let them choose without judgment or micromanagement. And then you have to hold them accountable for what they've chosen, because having anyone on the team who's just not accountable is just cancerous poison. Like that is the best way to just blow your team apart, letting someone run around and not have any consequences for their decisions. And this is really the hardest part of the job, because as producers and team leads, we never want people or projects to fail. But sometimes that's necessary. And many years ago, I had a rebel on a team, worked for a big game company, and she was she was highly valued, very well respected, great at what she did, but she really struggled to do any kind of minutia, bug fixing. So, and of course, as everyone knows, there always comes a time on any game project where that's all that's left, is the bug fixing. And so she just kind of really fell apart during that time. She was fomenting discontent, she was not showing up. When she was showing up, she's being really disruptive. And so I had to sit her down and say, look, you know, we need to talk about this. This isn't working. So let's look at the options. One of the options is you just decide you don't want to stay here anymore. But there are other options we can look at. So we kicked around a few ideas and consequences of those. And in the end, what we decided was that I was actually going to go to senior management and argue to get a feature put back into scope. And I would give that feature to her. So while everyone else is bug fixing, she would actually get to work on this project. And she was so well respected, the other team was like, yeah, that's cool, we're fine with that. And so the deal was, at the end of that time, she would just settle down and fix bugs. And she said, yes, I totally agree to that, that's very fair. So I held up my end, I went to senior management, I got the feature uncut, I gave it to her, she did a great job. And then of course, when it was over, she just went straight back to all the behaviors from before. And so I had to sit her down and say, do you remember the deal we had? And she said, yep. Okay, do you feel like I held up my end of the bargain? Yep. Do you feel like you held up your end of the bargain? Nope. And so that was her last day on the project. And that was sad, no one wanted to see her go, but at the same time, I think everybody recognized, including her, that that was a choice that she had made. And so that kind of took the sting out of it a little bit. So I'm down to 1 minute left. So for those of you, if you've made it all the way through this lecture and you have no idea what your tendency is, you can actually hit that URL, you can take a picture of it, or you can just Google it, GretchenRubin4Tendencies.com, or Gretchen Rubin 4 Tendencies quiz. I know that Games Week is a crazy week, but when Games Week is over, go get this book. I highly recommend it. There is fascinating producer shit in there that you will totally, I think, geek out on, and it's super interesting. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So I've got like 30 seconds left, so I don't think I have time for any questions, but if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'll be out in the hallway or whatever. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you so much for coming.